Hello, thank you. It's an intimidating task to present this drasha and explain what I'm trying to do with it in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. So our author is the Rebbe of Piasetzna, Rabbi Kolonius Kalman Shapira. The book in which this drasha is published is, most people know it as Esh Kodesh. The title that the Rebbe gave to his collection of sermons is Drashot Mishnot Azam, which has been translated as Sermons from the Years of Rage. The edition that your translation, or your Hebrew text is from Daniel Reiser, published a new edition of the Esh Kodesh, of this book in 2017. And what he did was take the Rebbe's handwritten manuscript and re-examined it using current technology and discovered a number of it's a better edition. He published it in facsimile. I'm going to go in a minute to the text so you can see what it looks like. Just want to situate the sermon historically in a minute. The Rebbe entered the ghetto in 1939 together with the Jews of Warsaw and the surrounding area. This is one of the last sermons that he gave, 1942, January 1942. He continued to edit the manuscript until 1943, when he gave it over to the Emanuel Ringelboim archive, and it was buried. It was rediscovered in 1950 when the ghetto was excavated after the war. And basically what interests me in this drasha, this sermon, is to understand the emotional experience that the Rebbe is addressing, his own and that of the people who he's addressing. So just want to speak a minute about the Hasidic sermon as a genre and what challenges face us as translators or as readers of it. So traditionally, the sermons that the Hasidic leaders gave were given on Shabbos or on holidays, when people couldn't write them down. Some of the Rebbes wrote them down before, many of them wrote them down afterwards, some of them were written down by other people. So we have a textual challenge as translators to understand how the text represents a live experience. Again, as translators, we have a more complicated task, which is how we convey the emotional experience that was certainly part of the drasha. Fortunately for us, in this case, the Rebbe wrote his own text. It was, as we'll see, it's a complicated or complex literary text, which has a very interesting construction. And I tried in my translation to sort of reflect that by numbering the sections. And I want to, in the little time that I have, try to give some examples of what I think the Rebbe was trying to do through the way that he used language. And again, just address how I tried to convey that in my translation of it. So one more word about historical context. I'm talking here about the figure of Amalek, which the Rebbe used the word Amalek, or the concept of Amalek, to speak about the Nazis. As Nehemiah Poland pointed out in his book on the Holy Fire, the sermons that the Rebbe gave were a realm of holiness. He never mentioned the word Germany, Nazis, but he used the euphemism of Amalek to describe the enemy. In this particular sermon, the symbol for Amalek, which is dust, or the snake, the dust-eating snake, is a central motif. And basically what interests him, in addition to identifying the enemy as Amalek, is explaining the emotional effect of the oppression of the Nazis, which is to turn the soul to dust. So this is part of the sermon that I translated here, where he basically talks about despair, the heart turning to stone, the faith becoming damaged, grief and suffering, breaking a person. I'm going to talk in a second about this idea of dust and how it's translated into an emotional experience, but that we understand it has a really close link to Amalek specifically, as that's the effect, the emotional effect of spiritual deterioration that the Rebbe is addressing here in this sermon. This is our drasha, our sermon that we're talking about. The Rebbe had a problem with his hand. He had a scribe during the first couple months of the war, and then something happened to him, and he ended up writing his drashot himself. So you see that it's an edited manuscript. He wrote it after he gave this sermon in 1942. He continued to edit it, and that's one of the huge contributions of this new edition, that Daniel Reiser looked at all of these marginal additions and saw how they were integrated into the text. There are parts of the text that are crossed out. There's a lot of scholarly discussion about whether the Rebbe lost faith or whether he didn't lose faith based on the editorial involvement of the manuscript. But what I'm emphasizing here is that we're, in this case, talking about a written text that we can really analyze and be very precise about the words that are used. The biblical context. The sermons are usually given on Shabbat. They start out with a verse or a situation from the parsha. In this case, we're in Parashat Ve'era. This is not going to read it, but this is the pasuk that he opens the drasha with. And basically the question for the Rebbe is, God promised that he's going to save the people, save the Jewish people. They're in dire distress now, so where is he? Where is he, and when, how? We're waiting for God to respond. There is another element here that I also want to talk about, which is the self-referential element. As we'll see, the Rebbe sees himself as a spiritual leader. He is a spiritual leader. And so Moshe Rabbeinu's question to Hashem is his question. There's a promise here that Moshe's challenge to Hashem appeared in the previous parsha, and we'll see he brings a really important Rashi on Moshe's challenge about where are you, Hashem, and why aren't you saving the Jewish people? And he transfers it to his own situation. In terms of translation, one of the questions or one of the challenges that we have is to try to find out, to identify the words that reappear throughout the text in order to understand it thematically, but also to translate it in a coherent way. In this particular case, the keywords that we have, or the Leitwort, as the Buber and Rosenzweig identified this element of translation, our keywords are dust and ashes, deshen. Interestingly, the word that the Rebbe uses is not efer, which is the more simple translation of dust, of ashes, but rather deshen. Why? Because the sacrifices were offered up, the sacrifice ascended, and the deshen remained. As we'll see in the intertextuality that I want to talk about in a minute, the motif that appears in all of the texts that the Rebbe brings. But what I want to emphasize here is the idea of sacrifice. Sacrifice in a simple sense, meaning animal sacrifices. In a more metaphorical and very real sense, it's the people who have been sacrificed in some incomprehensible way in this particular time in history. And then we have the motif, again, which appears in many, many words throughout the drasha, of these two vectors, the sacrifice that's burned and rises, and the ashes that descend and remain and go down. And then we have the failing of faith, and an ascent, an inspirational, spiritual, positive experience. So the Rebbe is always playing here on these two contradictory movements, and we have another two sets of dialectic: separation and connection, and loss, sorrow, grief, suffering on the one hand, and joy. So when I want to talk about conveying emotion, I'm going to be talking about these two different kinds of emotions, because I guess that's part of one aspect of these sermons that's really not discussed so much, but really for the Rebbe. And then I want to go back to what we've been talking about all morning long, the Baal Shem Tov's revelation to the Mashiach's revelation to the Baal Shem Tov, that redemption will come when your wellsprings will burst forth. This Rebbe, the Rebbe of Piaseczna, saw himself as being an agent, perhaps the most important current agent of making that revelation a reality. He saw himself in his role as he was responsible for not only teaching Hasidut, but living Hasidut as a call of the hour. And that's what this drasha is about. It's about how he, the Rebbe himself, used the principles of Hasidut in order to hold on to his faith and try to help other Jews around him remain believers despite everything that they were trying to confront. There are, in the first section of the drasha, a whole string of literary allusions. All of them relate to dust and to this danger of spiritual descent. I want to dwell here for a second on this really important interpolation of a text from the Talmud, which describes the experience of the Tana, Rabbi Yosef, who went into one of the ruins after the Chorban, after the destruction of the temple, and he hears this echoing voice, "Woe is me, for I have destroyed my house." Then the Rebbe asks here in the letters that I've emphasized, why hadn't he heard that voice before? This is a voice that's heard all the time, and Rabbi Yossi has some kind of revelation within this destroyed space. And that's the Rebbe's question: what enabled him to hear this? What he hadn't heard before? My question, I'll return to Rabbi Yossi there in a minute, because he brings the story at the beginning, and then he returns to it at the very end of the sermon. My question here is how emotion is conveyed linguistically. So I'm going to talk about two emotions. The first is the negative, the pain and the sorrow, etc. So what we have here, I think, as I translated the sermon, this dwelling on the notion of sacrifice. We have the sacrifice of Isaac, we have the sacrifices in the temple, and we have the human sacrifices of the Jews here in the ghetto. The notion of sacrifices in and of itself, once you transfer it from animals to people, is obviously something that's emotionally difficult. Here in lines 24 to 26, the Rebbe uses this word that the Jews have departed from us, and the word that he uses is ne'edarim, not that they died, that they're absent. And interestingly, it's not, apparently that I've seen other Hasidic texts that talk about people who have died as ne'edarim, unlike modern Hebrew that ne'edar means missing, and hopefully we find them if they're missing, but here ne'edarim means that they've left this world. But I think that when the Rebbe, he says departed, he says afterwards that they're gone. It's also ne'edru. I think that his way of sort of playing on this metaphor of the sacrifices or the ashes left from the sacrifice, that they're a presence. It's a presence that denotes absence. In other words, we see the ashes, we see the deshen on the altar, and the ashes which are there piled on the altar emphasize absence. And then, of course, he's also echoing this midrash that says that about Isaac, that his ashes are on the altar. In other words, even though he was saved and he wasn't sacrificed, there's something about the sacrifice of Isaac, which is, that's why Sarah died, right? That because she believed that he had actually been sacrificed. So that's the image of the ashes on the altar. When there's so many, they are in some sense praise to Hashem, because sacrifice has this positive aspect of it. So the Rebbe believes deeply that Jews are sacrificed and it's not in vain. And I think that's the beauty of the deshen that remains on the altar that he's trying to emphasize here. I'm just going to skip really quickly to the third part of the drasha, but I mentioned that it's marked there, number 3. In this third section goes into this other very lyrical, Kabbalistic kind of a mode where he talks about longing and the separation of God and the Shekhinah and awakening. And here I think we have a really important, totally other aspect of emotional language, that the words that he's using here are all about arousal, awakening, rejoicing, and this essential idea of the reversal. The Rebbe here, I think, is drawing on Chabad, this idea of being able to transform a negative experience into something positive. And that's basically the work, the avodah of Hasidut. What he does in this drasha is he goes into this Kabbalistic mode about really sorrow belongs to this world, and in the higher world, there's only joy. And then what he's trying to do in the course of the sermon is help whoever is listening to him or whoever is reading to him, reading his words, to understand that this reversal is always possible. Suffering belongs to this world, and if a person can connect to Hashem, you can somehow transcend that suffering, and because you understand that it's something that is temporal and belongs only to a lower form of experience. Just in conclusion, the last section of the drasha is so powerful. I worked on this drasha for many, many, many months, and still when I read it again after so long, it's moving for me again, because what the Rebbe does, he returns to his pasuk that he started out with. He recalls the story of Rabbi Yosef, and he returns to his question, how was it that Rabbi Yosef had this revelation of Hashem that he didn't have before? And he says it's because he was in a chorban. He was in this place of desolation where there's ashes all around, ashes or deshen. And then he recalls that Moshe Rabbeinu asked Hashem, why aren't you saving the Jewish people? And Hashem at that responded to him, Chaval al de'avdin. Right? The parsha says Hashem revealed himself to the forefathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in the name of Kel Shakai, but not in the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei, in the name of the other name of God. So when Rashi says Chaval al de'avdin, it's a reprimand to Moshe Rabbeinu. The forefathers had faith in Hashem, and no one asked any questions. But you, Moshe, you're asking, where's Hashem? Rebbe is saying, I'm asking, where's Hashem? Why isn't he saving us? Chaval da'avdin, instead of turning it making it a chastisement as it was for Rashi, he turns it into expression of mourning. Chaval al da'avdin, alas for those who are gone, meaning all of the Jewish sacrifices that are now gone. But now, and here's the reversal, from the arousal of chaval, of alas, that's what's going to bring the redemption. He turns the suffering around, and he, out of this, cry of despair that Hashem has maybe abandoned us, he's saying, make that into something that connects you back to Hashem again. If you're already asking, where's Hashem, that means you still believe he's there and that he can do something for you. In conclusion, I think that text and performance, I think that that's the power of this sermon, that the Rebbe teaches a way to live a very basic tenet of Hasidus, which is that through faith, redemption can come.
Before we hear from our other two panelists, I just wanted to invite you, Professor Wiskind, perhaps to narrate a bit about the process of translating this text, and the process for you of translating Hasidic texts in general. What are the particular challenges that you think come up for you, and what are perhaps the particular values that are guiding your practice of translation that you really are trying to realize in your translation work, and perhaps things that maybe have been missed in other approaches to translating Hasidic texts?
Okay. Well, first of all, I really need to thank you for inviting me to come speak here, because translation is my baby. And Hasidic texts, these Hasidic texts are something that I've sort of devoted most of my professional life to. When I started translating, I don't think there was a lot of recognition of Hasidic sermons as a literary text that can be engaged with not only for their conceptual ideas, but for their experience. And so I would say that I guess the biggest challenge for me in translating Hasidic texts was to try to preserve that experiential mode of them, which often means being loyal to understanding the conceptual ideational aspects of them, but not focusing on that so much. So a lot of times what that means, if you're trying to convey an experience, it means sort of being a channel through which the text flows, which means sort of using all of your rhetorical skills or understanding. Like, I read a lot of literature. Annie Dillard, by the way, was like a fantastic text for me. She's a writer, and she writes about writing, and her writing is very exciting. So I look for people like that who could like help me how to understand how to break up sentences, put rhetorical questions in the middle, choose words that don't have 5 syllables or even 4 or even 3. I like 1-syllable words are usually the best. And that's I would say, if anyone wants like a really quick translating tip, use little words, because they're the most immediate. They're really, when people talk, they use short words. And also to pay attention to in other words, okay, you asked me about method. You read the text, you read it 20 times. You try to figure out which lines move you the most, which lines really, I mean, these texts, either were spoken texts or they're texts, the ones that I choose to translate. I mean, not all Hasidic texts are so powerful emotionally, they're really not. You really have to, the texts that I bring in my books are ones that I look long and hard for because they have a bunch of characteristics that they need to have. But in terms of rhetoric, it is important to see the structure of the text, to see what the major words are, and then to figure out English equivalents that don't have Christian connotations or other kinds of connotations that we don't want. So that's another, like, I guess, major thing that needs to be done when you first approach a text.
Wonderful, thank you. So maybe we'll turn to Professor Litvak. There's also other, you should each have a microphone of your own. So,
so I'm going to keep things really brief because I think, the exciting part of all of this is the question and answer, and the discussion is really the heart of these kinds of sessions. And, but I do have to say 2 very quick things. First of all, I'm a complete interloper here. My own work is not on Chassidut. I'm a Litvak by name and by nature. And Bensi has very kindly, and Eli have very kindly opened the doors of this symposium to me and to my general ordinariness. I have done a lot of work on translation of 19th century Eastern European texts, but they are not Hasidic. It's actually, it's the exact opposite. I translate mitnagdik texts, and that is the place that I sort of live intellectually. So, I have to confess that at the last session, my hair was standing on end, but you do not need to hear about that. That's its confessional moment. So, I actually want to pick up. So, one thing I have to say, and I'm a practicing. I don't just translate in the course of teaching. I actually do this. So, I have some of the same kinds of experiences that Professor Wiskind has, primarily as it relates to intertextuality, and that's a whole separate question that really needs to be discussed. That applies to the enormous difficulties of rendering really any Jewish text, not exclusively Hasidic, the problems here are, the way I like to think about translation is that it's something that is both impossible and essential. You can't do it, but you have to do it. And that is a great struggle. But aside from that, and you should know that, I've also read a lot of translation theory, and there are translation wigs who think that everything is translatable, and translation Tories who think nothing is translatable. So I don't know where exactly I fit on this trajectory, depends on the day. But what I really want to respond to, actually, I was thinking about, as we were talking, about all kinds of things. The experiential component, the sort of how you render texts that are oral. Everything I translate is very written. So that's not a problem I have. But the orality and the experiential quality of a kind of communicative moment, that is very powerful and, worth talking about. And after today, I think Chassidut itself is a kind of fantasy of perfect translation, right? Of a perfectly transcendent communicative moment that always eludes us. So it could be translation is itself a way to think about the subject of the symposium. But really what interests me is the last thing you said. This business about avoiding in translation into English language that is Christological or Christian inflected in some way. This is, I think, really the thing that every translator of Jewish texts into English or into any Western language needs to think about very hard. Language is a form of life. You cannot remove it from its historical situation, from the way its users understand certain words. They can't simply be pared down or somehow stripped of meaning. We say more than we mean as soon as we start to translate. And the difficulty is just enormous. And, this is, like I said, this is something you have to do, but you really can't do, or you can't do it, but you do it anyway. But the enormous challenge of, how should I put this, of translating Jewishness, right? Not just Jewish texts or texts in a Jewish language, but how you render the Jewishness of a text in a language that is, in language in which Milton wrote. And Milton is a nice example, right? Like that. Milton is welcome. I mean, Jews love Milton, but it's also, it's the language that is, I'm going to say something, provocative here, but it's language that's hostile to Jewishness. It's not just neutral. And so when you use words like soul and spirit and God, my favorite translation story is I had for many years I worked with Everett Fox, who's the translator of the Hebrew Bible, and he used to tell the story about how he used to go to Barnes and Noble and sign his translation of the Chumash, and somebody would say to him, "Professor Fox, don't you feel strange signing?" Putting your name on this book, and he said, "Don't worry, I always write F-X." So that is my favorite translation story, because I always have to tell my students that this is a huge stop doing this. The God is not God's name, right? It's the word we use as a kind of placeholder for the word we do not use. It is not, it's literally non-translatable. So don't do it. Don't write G-D. It's ridiculous. And it's not a gross ignorance. But that is exactly the kind of thing. I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, it is the sort of intractable barrier here. It is just, it's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night. And this is why I often think that Hebrew texts in the translation always end up being so much longer, because everything takes more words to explain. And I appreciate the power of this, we used to use short words, but you have to use many more of them. And there's a kind of weird unraveling that happens, and you're constantly, and the reason for me translating is such a great experience is I'm constantly testing my own concepts, right? I mean, when I say this, what do I mean? What does it really, what does it mean to say the word soul, or to say the word delight, or to say the word joy, or to say the word suffering? Are these words really, what do they convey exactly? And as someone who comes from outside, well, in many ways outside of the street, I'm always struck by, the enormous power, emotional power of Hasidut, to me, is all about this, right? It's about some kind of bridge over an abyss, which I got to tell you, Mitnagdim and the Litvish, we're perfectly comfortable with the abyss. We live in the abyss. But that said, I can really appreciate the desire, right? I'm always amazed at how at this kind of magical effect, right, of this language. And it's extraordinary that it comes across in English at all, right? So, so there are two things that I'm going to just stop in a second, but, there are sort of two things to think about here, for any audience. And you're all bilingual. Well, hopefully, please God, you're all bilingual, but I'm sure you're not, but some of you are not. But, what I would say is that the kinds of experiences the translators have are really an argument for language learning. We inhabit a world now for the first time I'm going to put on my Jewish historian hat. One of the things that is distinct about the last 200 years of Jewish life, no one talks about this, but to me, this is the biggest, this is the real problem, right? That for the first time in Jewish history, Jews have ceased to be bilingual. And for many Jews today, it's inconceivable a conference like this 200 years ago in English, right? For most of you, and for me, I live out of a linguistic suitcase, but for most people in this room, English is their first language. What does it mean for a Jewish person, right? To have English as their first language, and maybe not even to be in command of a second language that serves as a point of critical reflection for the way you use English. What does it mean to be unself-conscious in English and to be a Jew? I don't know. That's hard. And so the translators today have a more critical function than ever, and a great responsibility. This is the reason I don't sleep at night. But the newness of this moment, right, is, the fact that we need to reflect on the process of translation, where translation is no longer just a kind of reading aid for people who are reading the work in the original. And, in Chabad, in the 19th century, did a lot of work in bridging another linguistic divide between the vernacular Yiddish and Hebrew. I mean, this is, Chabad has many achievements to its credit, but this bridging is probably the most profound, right? And this question was asked this morning about this. Someone asked Professor Diner about, the elites and the Proste Yidden, and the work that was done simply on a bilingual kind of literature, right? That bridged that divide. I mean, that's the translation task. But until recently, blip, 200 years, right? I mean, most Jews could at least command the vernacular, right? Which gave them access to the Holy Tongue. And they were used to, who was it that told me this story? I think that, there's a student who came from like a Reform background and went to Israel and came back and said, oh my God, those people, they pray in synagogue and they actually know what the words mean. And, that is the moment that we're living in today. I find it kind of terrifying, frankly. But like I said, I'm a Litvak, so I'm comfortable with the abyss. Okay, I'm going to pass the microphone to Dalia.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can.
Yeah. Oh, here, mine works.
Well, I think.
Oh, yours.
I think maybe. Are we good? So I'll say first of all that I too have no. I'm not expert in Hasidic text by any means, and so I come to this from the perspective of an editor of a wide variety of Yiddish texts in English translation. And so I think at times my attention to the text was really on a fairly atomic level. But now that this sort of question of English has been brought up and the Englishes that we translate into, I wanted to reflect a little bit on my own experience of reading this and paying attention to the resonances of the English, because something that I found quite curious in a way, where you discuss the vocabulary and the keywords of ashes and dust. The deshen you bring in, and these are fatty ashes, the deshen you bring in italic transliteration, I believe, in the translation. We have also efer, but that sort of, and I think it does appear a couple of times also in the drasha, but in the English translation, you have both of those sort of collapsed into a single word, ashes. And then there's the afar, or the dust. And I was thinking about the experience of reading this text in English, of reading the translation in English, and how the English has these certain affordances, Christian affordances, as well as Jewish traditional affordances. So one that we might think of to a sort of in a popular, I think a phrase that has made its way into sort of Jewish popular idiomatic use is something like Rav Bunim's, pockets notes, and there are different versions of this story, right? But the phrase "V'anochi afar va'efer," right? I am but dust and ashes. So you have a Jewish context in which this sort of pairing appears. But another very prominent and I think relevant, interesting example from a Christian context is the Book of Common Prayer, comes from the 16th century, has a phrase that we all know in American English context of ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And so there, what you have is this pre-existing texture in English that pairs dust with death and dust with ashes and human death specifically. And not only that, but I think there's this book, there's this moment in time, right? That source, the Book of Common Prayer as a text. And there's the sort of popular American depictions. We can all think of a movie where we've seen a priest scattering ashes and saying ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So you have that phrase in common English, non-Jewish, cultural, environments. And I think that because of this pairing of ashes and dust and human death, you get this sort of, I found for me, I think, the phenomenological experience of reading this text, which points, as much as it is contained and doesn't, as you say, reference in historical, explicit, concrete terms what is going around, what is happening around in the writing, but the fact that there's an affordance in the English of ashes and dust and human death and cremate, right? Your mind makes these associative jumps towards cremation. And I think, right to the Holocaust, and to cremation of Jewish bodies, even though this is happening in the Warsaw Ghetto. So there's the experience of burning and destruction of Jewish bodies, Jewish property, Jewish buildings, Jewish life. Even though this is a ghetto experience, so we're not in the camps yet, but there's an inevitable, So there's an inevitable association, and I think, I think reading this in 2025, it sort of is a compounded, I think, tragedy for a Jewish reader associating ashes in the last 2 years, especially with Jewish death. So this is, I think, one example of the way that the vocabulary of dust and ashes, in the particular context of being translated into English, strikes up a web of associations, not only within Jewish Hebrew vocabularies, but the various other kinds of Englishes, and English is very, very Christian origins, right? The influence of the King James Bible, its place in the formation of English, and the way that those how so much of English, idiomatic English traces back. So So I was very curious to hear you say sort of, how can we avoid, or how do we navigate the inevitable, or maybe not inevitable, linkages, and what is sort of that process, and are the affordances of English beyond the Jewish context, or what we think of as a more familiar context, are those helping, or are those interfering at times? So sort of the reader experience that I just described, what do you think of that? And is that something desirable, or are you trying to avoid it entirely? And then maybe there are all these other Englishes, right? Of art scroll translations, and or pre-existing translations by the Princeton Rebbe, of works by the Princeton Rebbe, and how are you interacting with other translations of his work? So, I think maybe I'll. Oh, do I have any more time, or should I stop? I think just one more. Yeah, I think I'll just say one more. I have one more question about intertextuality, especially speaking to what you were mentioning, which is that, and especially looking at that photo that you brought for us of the manuscript versions of the Drashot, I'm curious about the different layers of that text. So as you mentioned, he was writing. There were. I managed to get a copy of the Reiser edition, and it was really fascinating to look at. So there were emendations that he was making as he was writing, it seems. There were ones that once he had completed the body of the text, he went and looked at it again and maybe made some other edits, sometimes even placing them in different parts of the page. And then he was also editing as he went along and revisited the drasha later. So I'm curious about, in a sense, you've provided us with Daniel Reiser's Hebrew proof, and the Pizasna Rebbe intended this to be printed, right? The Tfus. Do you see yourself also, I'm curious about the role that the manuscripts might have played in your process, the translation of also Reiser's proof. And I was noticing that sometimes some of these notes that he makes are putting in citations, right? Or expanding on certain things. And I'm curious about, especially if one is adding citations, what sort of maybe impulse or intent to increase the...
Where do you stop?
Where do you stop? But also like making transparent the intertextuality. So if one is adding references, is there a sense of trying to increase the access of future generations? And he was speaking to people far beyond him. And so is there a kind of imperative also to increase that access? And in any way are his edits, what do you gain from the sort of multiple timestamps of that editing process in terms of his own experience of trying, coming back and thinking, well, actually, this is what was missing. So what is your relationship to those edits?
Thank you. Thank you both for an attentive reading. Great questions. I'll relate to them in order. Afar ve'efer, dust and ashes. Remember that it was Abraham who first used that term toward Hashem. I'm just dust and ashes, and that goes into the Christian context, I think, from the Bible. I was actually, as I was writing, also thinking about this nursery rhyme that I'm sure everybody said while they were jumping rope. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Yes. That relates to the plague, right? In England in the 17th century, which I never knew when I was a 6-year-old. But so that also that consciousness of ashes and dust and human decay and all that is sort of, it's sort of when you get beyond the nursery rhyme, it is a little bit chilling. I was actually very curious to know, in terms of the timeline, we know that there were, in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto, people didn't know for quite a while about the crematoria. There were 2 Jews who escaped from, where did they escape from? It might have been Dachau, I don't remember. They escaped and they came back to Warsaw. It was Belgium. Okay. This was in the end of January 1942. A week after the Rebbe said this drasha, that news came into the ghetto for the first time about the crematoria. So one of my questions was, is the Rebbe alluding to this in the drasha? I don't know. Certainly when he said it, it was before the news had come. But as we said, he edited afterwards. So I don't think you can read this as a Jew, post-Holocaust. We can't read this without thinking about that too. So it's definitely there. Also, when you're talking about this whole motif of presence and absence and the effect of a sacrifice after it's been sacrificed and the power of the loss of Jewish lives to cause Hashem to do something in this world, I mean, that's there whether or not you know about the actual extermination of Jews. So all of that intertextuality, I think that, the dust and ashes and the whole Christian thing, it was there. And in fact, I even called this section in my book, A Desire in Dust and Ashes, because I was playing on that, on the Christian Jewish sort of, here we are in English. Those are what those words mean for us. And I knew about the Christian overtones, but that was okay because that's what we're composed of. So that is about the editing and the layers of the textual layers. It's probably certainly something that scholars have speculated about ever since the sermons were first published in the 1960s. The whole question of, there were, even before Reiser's edition, questions about the chronology of the drashot. If people, historians and critics, tried to chart some kind of spiritual trajectory of the Rebbe's own dealing with the Holocaust. And in fact, Nehemiah Poland points this out. There are other people who disagree with him. I'm going to go with Poland because I think that he has the best reading, that in the early years of the Holocaust, the Rebbe used the more traditional forms of dealing with Jewish suffering, which was linking it to sin, as if secularization or the abandonment of religion was the reason, in quotation marks, that God had brought this suffering upon the Jewish people. But the Rebbe was a very honest, believing Jew, and by 1940, he rejected that. And I think that it's very clear in the sermons that he pretty much comes out and says, I believe this but this kind of suffering that I'm seeing now, it can't be that Hashem is punishing us because Hashem loves the Jewish people. And then he starts looking for a more esoteric, abstract, hidden explanation for Jewish suffering. So I think that when you look at Reiser's new edition of the sermons, and you see these layers, you can see much more clearly the Rebbe's own wrestling with his earlier theological assumptions and the rejection of them. Like, he crosses things out, and he crosses them out violently, and you can even see from the weight of the pen on the paper his emotional sort of inability to accept certain theological assumptions that he himself, or the Orthodox establishment, believed in earlier. So also the addition of allusions, I guess I'll point it out. Just end on, this is a text, it's a written text, and the Rebbe indeed was very aware that he himself would probably not survive this period, but his writings would. And so he crafted them as a document, a spiritual confession, but as a document of Jewish faith and survival that was totally intertwined with texts. It's not the Rebbe giving his personal philosophy, it's the Rebbe sort of having all the generations of Jewish attempts to understand the ways of Hashem in this world. They're all intertwined in his own text. When he gave it over to be buried and preserved in some miraculous way that he couldn't imagine, to be preserved for future generations, he wrote as his last testimonial his request that his writings be published so that people would read them, that it should be a memory for him, but so that his vision that he was, like Rabbi Yosei in the ruin, the vision that he had gained through this terrible period would bring redemption for the Jewish people. So I'll just end with that by our own engagement with his texts, we're really doing what the Rebbe asked us to do, and hopefully participating in the movement that he wanted to make a reality.
I think that this has been really, really a fascinating conversation. And in particular, Olga, what you said about translation being both impossible and essential, I think is really striking. And I think there are definitely ways in which it's perhaps, this is certainly true for all translation, because in all translation, there's going to be a context and a web of associations that the original text is embedded in, that the new reader simply doesn't have access to, and that the new language isn't able to bring with it. But there are certain reasons why it's particularly acute, and perhaps it's even more impossible, and perhaps therefore all the more essential in the case of Jewish texts, and Hasidic texts in particular. And so I think we've already heard a bunch of different reasons come up. In a way, a bunch of different contexts that Jewish and in particular Hasidic texts sort of hold or are embedded in, that it's a tremendous challenge to sort of to bring to bear in translation. So there's the question of intertextuality, that basically any Jewish text, especially written before the mid-20th century, is going to be just steeped in associations to other Jewish texts, and often they're kind of not even really spelled out, but just sort of flagged, perhaps even in the use of a single word like deshen. When you use the word deshen, there's a sort of the learned reader automatically can make an association that the word ashes simply doesn't hold. Forgetting about the fact that ashes brings with it a whole nother set of associations. So there's a problem of intertextuality. Often the case in Hasidic texts in particular, and especially Chabad texts, there's a question of how to sort of relate a web of conceptual and especially philosophical concepts and idioms that a text is sort of relying on the original reader to have had access to or to have been familiar with. But then there's also some more, in a sense, there are more intangible aspects to Hasidic texts in particular. There's a question of a sort of the ta'am, the flavor, the taste, the vibe of the culture in which these texts originate. Often they're oral texts. Often they were delivered in environments that were sort of rich in a particular form of cultural life that the modern reader doesn't really have access to. And then something that Ora you've spoken about as being really important is even more personally the sort of and even more intangible is the question of conveying a certain kind of experience, whether it's an emotional experience, perhaps of suffering, or also, a spiritual experience. At the end of the day, Hasidic texts are all, in a sense, even in their original language, trying to perform a certain kind of translation, trying to take a sort of transcendent experience and communicate it, something that's deeply personal, and communicate it in an intersubjective way. So all of these things are these are there, and there are more to mention. There's all these layers, and it makes it all the more impossible. So I suppose I'm curious in general, not that we have a tremendous amount of time, but perhaps if some or all of you would like to comment on, strategies for, I suppose, I can see at least two approaches to this general problem. One might be, the question of a translation as a means of teaching, in a sense, or a means of opening up the very context. So there a question might be, how can and this works for some contexts more than others. It might work for the intertextual basis or the philosophical context more than for the personal experience. But how could a translation be used to sort of teach the new reader about the sort of worlds that this text is coming from? And you mentioned, Dalia, the question of sort of citations or footnotes, explanations along the margins of the text. But how do you do that without compromising the integrity of the text as a text? Because it's very easy, and often, having sort of fiddled with this myself a little bit, it's very easy to get carried away trying to communicate what the background of a text to the reader in translation. And so how do you communicate something of that while maintaining the integrity of the text? And alternatively, perhaps my second line of attack is really if we think that that's asking too much, how do we construct a translation that at the very least sort of makes the new reader aware of the tremendous foreignness of this text? Because I think one of the risks of translation is that there's an illusion of familiarity to the new reader. And so how can we try, if we're not going to be able to give over the context of these texts to the new reader, how can we at least make the reader aware in translating that there are these worlds that they're not familiar with and that they don't have access to, but that they're there, and you need at the very least to be aware of them. Perhaps the second step might be to go and learn something about them. But even before that, it's about sort of not letting the reader think that they have the text at their fingertips.
Okay, so so there are essentially two theories. I mean, what you've outlined here are there are two theories of translations that really match up to sort of two theories about language. And I think the answer to your question has to do with sort of, what theory do you want to live with? And one theory says that there is that language is representational. So there's a kind of, and it's a language based on sort of kind of metaphysical certainty, that language represents or expresses things that are out there. And theoretically, since those things are out there, you should be able to render them, right? The translation should be relatively smooth. And what but that creates all kinds of problems, right? Because if there's a reality out there the text is representing, you can't really get close to it, right? So that opens up the gap, and that makes translation in a way impossible, except, because you can't get to that like metaphysical reality. You can't get very close to it. But then the other theory says, well, language is a medium of communication that creates its own reality. And so that every situation that exists between the translator and the text, it mirrors almost exactly the situation that exists between any speaker and any listener. And it assumes that there is no perfected thing out there, some, ding an sich that, you were trying to render, but that the essential thing is the point of contact. And I think about this the way that, these texts that you're translating are out of time, and yet they seem entirely timely, right? That is not because, there's some kind of, metaphysical reality behind them. It's precisely because there isn't, that they can speak out of time and feel intimate and real. And, it's precisely when you let go of the metaphysical ballast, right? You let go of the net, that you can you can gain. A lot is to be gained in that, abyssal space, right? There's a lot you can do with it. Because once you assume that language is what we have, you realize this is not nothing. This is everything. And so the idea is how to create a kind of, how to use what you have to create the same kind of intimacy, between the text and the reader. And that is actually, it's a more optimistic conception of translation, but it relies on a more pessimistic conception of language and what it can do. And I'm a very big believer in this kind of thing, that, the idea is to play into this situation and to accept what Bialik called the tension between revelation and concealment. And if you let go of this idea of a total translation, of a kind of perfected text, you get everything, right? You can create a situation. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So, Russian translation, the translation of Russian text is a huge problem. And especially, you often see this problem reflected in like attempts to create a kind of fake 19th century Russian that's going to sound like the Russian of Dostoevsky. And in English, it sounds totally stilted and ridiculous. It reads like a translated text. So the best translation of Crime and Punishment is very recent. And what's amazing about it, it's really good. He let go of all of that. He didn't want to be authentic. He said, I can't do that. And this is not a Russian text. This is an English text. And it's going to be as English as I can make it. He produced a translation that was magnificent and actually gives the English-speaking reader a taste of the book. So when I was translating Lilienblum, and when you read like these translations of 19th century Hebrew text, they're all stilted. They try to turn it some kind of weirdo Victorian Anglo whatever. I translate Lilienblum. He didn't talk like that. And the texts in Hebrew don't read like that. So I adopted a kind of vernacularity, right? I tried to imagine him talking to his best medrash audience. And I said, well, what would that sound like in English? So it's not, you move away completely from the idea of literality, because there's nothing that can be rendered perfectly. And you say, it's all fluid. There's a gap. I'm going to play into the gap. And I'm going to think about the communication situation now. And who are the people who need this text now? And sometimes miracles happen, and occasionally you get a reader who says, I got to read the Russian, or I got to read the Hebrew. And that's a great moment, right? But the quest for excellence, for a kind of metaphysical realization, should not drive out the possibility of the good. And we can do a lot of good with the gap. So that's how I deal with it.
I'll just say something quickly that made me think about, which is that there's this translator, one of his big languages into English is German. He translates a lot of German into English. Damien Searles, who recently wrote this book that I recommend to everyone called The Philosophy of Translation. And he says, how can we have these conversations about the accuracy or faithfulness into the text? You're changing all the words. Right. So stop there. He makes German texts, which are famously made incredibly complex and clunky in translation. He in English translation, I think he finds ways to inject a more vernacular approach and a different relationship to nouns and verbs and adjectives that feel more natural in the English. So that's just on the question of what kind of where is that preciousness of brown language misapplied? When we were doing these exercises in the fellowship of translating the Yiddish, and this question that you said of sort of what do you do? How do you not lose that flavor? And I think there needs to be an attentiveness, I think, especially to the internal usage of the community of that language. Something that I found especially illuminating, working in Charuta with Masha Shalar, who's in the audience, who has a Chabad background, and there were terms like der Herr that I was not familiar with their accepted communal usage. And then this question arises of, so do we put italics on it and do we foreignize it to the point that it makes the text quite strange? Something else Damien Searles says is you only have so many weirdness points. Right. And what do we gain from, well, do we keep der Herr, or do we say integrate it through and through, something like that, where we have a klang, right, a sound of through in the der Herr, and maybe that becomes a fixed term. Can we make the English a little bit strange, but also that strangeness, when it becomes a fixed term, becomes something that's sort of conceptually consistent, and something that I find in my so something that we do with our style sheet is we say, if it's in the Merriam-Webster dictionary online, then we'll keep it. We won't italicize it. So Gabbai and Shabbos, we won't italicize because these are words that have entered American English parlance, and why should we foreignize them? But then, right, there are other examples that maybe should be. Yeah,
wonderful. So why don't we actually now open it up to the audience, and I'll invite some questions.
Thank you. I'm going to piggyback off of what Dalia was saying, because this is a conversation we had a lot back and forth when we were translating about the idea of foreignization versus domestication, especially when you're translating, but I think particularly when, as been said, you're translating into a language that's really purpose-built for a different religion, a different set of cultural experiences. My question is, obviously, translation, you need to think about, is it maybe not user-friendly, but user-usable at least? But is the only faithful translation one that maxes out on foreignization or on weirdness points? How much are you as the translator expected to domesticate so that it is something that the reader will be able to engage with? But then are you betraying the original text in some way? And is it your responsibility, especially when taking something from a Jewish language that's full of Jewish content into English, how much can you push on that foreignization side before you cross the line into something that's, no longer useful or usable to the reader?
Well, I think I want to go back to something that Ora said, right? I mean, it depends on the stakes, right? And clearly here, the stakes are high in your work. And you take the risks you need to take, right? That's what I meant when I said impossible and necessary. And that when it begins to feel serious, like I must do this, all these problems that are, they become very, local problems, and you decide on them, on the basis of other things that you have to do. And, but the imperative, I mean, there is an ethical imperative, I imagine, here in translation. It is so powerful. And, the idea of creating a situation where this text once again arises out of silence and communicates, it trumps everything else. And the higher the stakes, and they're different for every translator, I felt that the stakes with Lillian Bloom were very high. And I was prepared to give up on all kinds of things because it seemed important to me that this text makes it into English. And I got to tell you, in your case, I mean, I know Lillian Bloom wanted to be read, but you for sure knew because your guy told you, right? And when you have a text that's saying to you, I need to be read, and you are the translator, that's what you do. He never talked about faithfulness, right? I mean, this question of, you got to let go of this absolute. Faithfulness in translation, I mean, faith applies in all kinds of realms. I'm not so sure it applies here. It's a nice thing to say, but what does it really mean? I mean, I think Dalia is right. I mean, Searle is right. You change all the words. What are you doing? Once you're there, you're there. And I think that the ethical imperative, like the ethical imperative in reading, it trumps everything else.
Thank you. I just wanted to emphasize, so the escapee was Grojanowski from Chelmno, which was the gas fans, and just because I think I said Belgium, so it was Chelmno. Ora, I want to ask you if you mean what I think you mean. There's this Amalek who's compared to the serpent that eats the dust, and the dust seems to be being used interchangeably with ashes. So is this an Amalek unlike any other Amalek that actually devours our very ashes? And maybe is that then the strength, because such an odd phrase at the end, the arousal from Chaval. So what is that arousal from Chaval? It's such a bizarre concept that the anguish, this level of anguish is so great that this is going to bring the redemption. So in other words, you had to go through this absolute worst Amalek in order to achieve this absolute best, most wondrous result. For second part of the question, it seems like you're weighing in on whether he loses faith, and you're saying absolutely not. And if so, I agree. I mean, it's very superficial, those who claim that because he's wrestling with something, he loses faith. It seems like what you're saying is, paradoxically, he gains faith through the very anguish because it has to lead to redemption eventually. So I'm curious about that. If that's what you're implying here, that he actually strengthens his faith paradoxically, if it's possible to argue that. And to Olga, I just want to say, we had this whole conversation about words. I'm wondering if translation is the key to all of this, because when we use terms like Judaism, we're translating something into English. When we use, these other words, and maybe translation's always imperfect, and we can work with it. Anti-Semitism was another term that you dislike, you said, but isn't that a translation too? So I'm just wondering if that's a framework where we can start to think about these very problematic terms that we've sort of adopted unconsciously.
I want to just relate to this idea of the motif that I didn't really talk about in the central motif in this sermon is the practice in the temple that was called Terumat HaDeshen. After the sacrifices were burned and the ashes were left on the altar, the Kohen would come and take a shovelful of the ashes and raise them. And that theurgically is what the Rebbe is talking about. In other words, there's this idea of sacrifice that goes up, part of the sacrifice that remains down. That's the despair and the loss of or experience of loss of faith that his whole, everyone in the ghetto is experiencing. And then the Rebbe symbolically in this drasha, when he's talking about raising the ashes, he's talking about redeeming ourselves through arousal from below in order to arouse Hashem from above to bring redemption. So it goes in both directions, and that if we're talking about faith, yes, he's talking about the loss of faith. He's confronting before his eyes, perhaps within himself too. It's a question. I mean, Rebbe Yosei, who goes into this ruin, he goes in there in a place of mourning, and that's when he receives this revelation. So it's a very self-referential sermon, the whole thing, but it really is the Rebbe's desire to have something be revealed to him as well. He performs it, he speaks of it, and he performs it. So I don't want to weigh in, did he lose his faith or not lose his faith? He's certainly struggling with the question of faith, but the message of this drasha is let's do something about it and not go down to become dust.
Can I just, this question about where you stop? I mean, as you were talking, 63 things were going through. This brings up like the burning bush and the idea of communication and fire, and this up and down. I mean, there is the question of where this is endless, right? And, but at the same time, I think in this context, the language of sacrifice is deeply problematic, right? And, it's familiar to us, but there's a way to push back against it, and it's hard. What do you do? I mean, this is a person who is living through this moment, and this is the imagery on which he draws. Today, the word Holocaust with a lowercase h for Jews is not so easily digestible. So there's all sorts of problems here. But the thing about the perfect moment of communication out of fire, I mean, that is, Bialik used that, it's everywhere. I mean, so the question is like, that's hard to manage, right? And the publisher will only give you a certain number of words and a certain number of footnotes, and you just have to say, okay, that's enough, right? But this is an image that is enormous, of enormous potency. But the answer to your question is that all the words you're asking me about are not translations. They're neologisms. And that is a much bigger problem. I mean, I'll give you my favorite example of this is, the word Jew, which everybody uses absolutely unproblematically, and everyone knows what it means. It's a word that you don't even think about, right? But it's a translation of a translation. And it's really a neologism that is, it's only used in the biblical canon once. I mean, in one book, and it is satiric. It doesn't have any direct, it's in Esther. And it's clear that in Esther, that word has a very specific context and is being used polemically. The word, there are no Jews in the Talmud, right? The word Israel is used, and the word, and that word is used because there's a certain value, right, in a word that has no plural and no singular, and that can be used both for one and for many. When you use the word Jew, that's a neologism that is it's invented to do something that I'm not sure I want to do. And the word anti-Semitism the case is even more clear. These neologisms are precisely not translations. I am arguing, an argument for translation is an argument against the neologism, against this kind of, speaking in quotation marks. So it's a different problem. And it is precisely, it's the problem that translation may solve.
I have a question not about the specific Josh, but about translating Hasidic drasha in general, which the conference is about, or symposium is about taking Hasidus and bringing it into the modern or non-Hasidic world. I don't remember the exact language. And something I think about a lot is Hasidic drashas are long, and there's often a really beautiful nugget in the middle of something that is either like not relevant to the life of the person I'm trying to give it to, or sometimes problematic morally for whatever reason. And I'm wondering, not from if you're translating academically, this feels like a clearer question to me, but if you're translating for a broader audience for spiritual, to help the spiritual life of people in front of you, what do you do with parts that are problematic or troublesome?
It's a great question. You censor them. You just skip over the parts that you don't want. It's a question that I deal with a lot. I mean, I guess one difference between maybe the work that I do and more that I don't take whole texts that I translate chapters and many pages. I choose excerpts because when I bring Hasidic teachings, it's within a larger context, whether it's historical, cultural, psychological. I usually have some kind of a matrix in that I'm talking about Hasidus, and then within that I have the close readings, which enables me to elegantly skip over the parts that are less politically correct or whatever, because most of my writing is really for a general audience, and I'm not interested in antagonizing people. The Jew question is obviously very big, like when you're going to talk about Jews and when you're going to talk about people. And of course, you don't talk about man anymore, whoever put these titles here, like we're gender neutral these days. So I think the texts speak to me, and I'm certainly not a man. So, God and man, it doesn't work anymore. But that's the kind of sensitivity that I think is really important in choosing text, and in if you're going toward a general audience. Yeah, a lot of times, I mean, our Hasidic masters were, they suffered a lot from their non-Jewish environment, and so they were often very antagonistic. But that's a historical aspect that I personally am not so interested in conveying. So yeah, it's a selective cutting of things in order to preserve what I think is really the spirit of the text, or what it's trying to do in a more universal level. Avoidance, yeah, but it's okay.
I have a question about, or maybe to ask you to respond for an observation that I have as someone who thinks in Hebrew. Maybe a result of the fear of translating, especially in Jewish contexts, might be what sometimes seems as a silly mystification of the Hebrew language as such. So oftentimes I would discuss a text, sometimes a Hasidic text with someone, and would tell me, this is not just light, this is or. And you have the serious look in your face as if the word or and a serious nod conveys so much more because it's in Hebrew, right? Or it's not intelligence, it's sechel. Something about, and then it goes in the spectrum of gamification of we're not having a girls' night, we're having an Erev Banot, right? Because you don't, the way of using Hebrew as untranslatable and as mystical without, unnecessarily so, because there are real problems of translation, but then because you're afraid of translating. And whenever, I will just share that when I raise this up, usually many American Jews roll their eyes and saying, that's such a Zionist perspective. You treat Hebrew as just another language, right? It's Lashon HaKodesh. You're not supposed, it's untranslatable almost by definition in a way. And the audacity of treating it as just another language. I mean, how can you take the Rebbe Rashab's text and treat it as, a text with prepositions and points that can be conveyed? But maybe to go back to it results in what seems to me a distorted and maybe historically inaccurate way of looking at Hebrew and how it was used. So yeah, just.
That's a form of linguistic idolatry, right? To which I don't subscribe. And I don't know, from everything I said, I think that's, I hope it's clear. Every language has an aura, right? And, I speak, Russian has an aura, and Russians talk exactly like this about Russian. And, so I don't think this is, communities who value a particular language, especially when that is not the language that their kids are speaking in school, right? That it does carry a tremendous kind of burden. And there are certain things you can't do if you maintain that attitude. And, so that said, I mean, that said, the special, I mean, yeah, it's not a Zionist perspective, and frankly, it's a kind of, I mean, I'm so scared about what I'm going to say. How can I put this? The Kabbalistic tradition, of course, is heavily indebted to a certain attitude towards language, right? So the idea that this is a direct form, this is, of communication to the divine, I mean, you don't need Zionism for that. And the idea of a lashon that is kodesh is part of this. I think it's a vernacular attitude. It's part, and it's a placeholder in many ways, just like, that's what idolatry is too, a placeholder that you fetishize in place of other things, right, with which the speaker may be less familiar, right? It's much easier to latch on to certain icons than it is to think about what the language is actually communicating, right? I mean, so that is one of my objections to a form of linguistic idolatry that I see in many places, right? And, I am interested in the situation, right, that creates a kind of relationship, okay? So and the relationship, which is the place where ethics is born, is linguistically constructed, and without language you can't do anything. But the ultimate, it is a vehicular situation. It is not, and to fetishize it is to do exactly the wrong thing. And I say wrong, I mean, it's like, wrong, right? I mean, you got to hear, the way I hear. I mean, ethically, it's misplaced, right? And there's a reason why idolatry is fundamentally objectionable within the Jewish view of things. I wanted to respond to your comment. I mean, Ora, it's not just, I actually think that writing for an academic audience, and I don't see myself as writing for an academic, I write for whoever wants to read me. But I think the pressures for academic translators is actually greater than for you, if you imagine your audience. I mean, but so it's a real problem. But I prefer, frankly, again, this is part of the idolatry. The reason I want to answer your question is because this is the same issue. I mean, we turn linguistic words into concepts and we reify them. We think that when we use them, that's a form of, oppression that is quite direct. But of course, it's not direct, right? And anyone who's ever experienced, a slap in the face knows the difference between a slap in the face and the usage of a certain word in one's company, right? So I object to this kind of what, the Milton objected to it. I'm not the first to object, right? I mean, these words need to enter into discussion so we can figure out how we use them, what they mean to us, but they have to be an ethical challenge for us. And I self-consciously don't avoid them. I put them in and I say, okay, what is it doing here? A word is more than what it means. A word does certain things. And it is only by being unafraid and taking responsibility for what you're doing that you can, then it becomes a thing you can talk about rather than this idol you put in the corner of the room and, afraid to walk by, because it'll hurt you. Sorry, sticks and stones. You ever heard of that? Right? So anyway.
So I think we have to wrap up. But perhaps just in conclusion, we've spoken a lot about the impossibilities of translation, but I think it's also worth, in a sense, the conversation was veering there towards the end, to mention perhaps there's tremendous Jewish faith in translation, and for thousands of years we've been engaged in processes of translation. You think about the Targum. But also the way that Jewish learning works. Jewish learning often works. You have the text in one language, and you're learning it in a different language, and it doesn't seem that you just do that out of necessity. There seems to be something. There's understood to be something actually essential in that very process of translation. So perhaps to as a parting thought, it might be worth thinking. as impossible as it is to capture one world in another, what also, there's some reason why, as Jews, we continue to have faith in the importance of doing that very process. So thank you very much to our panelists.